300 chairs filled the cathedral of the Northern Pact, and in less than 1 hour, Alexa Holbrook would stand before every seated lord, general, and foreign dignitary and read the words that would bind 2 kingdoms into a single alliance. Her hands were already shaking. She pressed the ceremonial scroll flat against the herald's lectern in the vestry behind the cathedral's eastern transept, her fingers tracing the wax seal she would crack in front of the entire assembly. 1 hour, 1 reading, 1 chance to do exactly what she had been trained to do since she was old enough to project her voice across a stone courtyard. Except the words on the scroll were wrong. Not wrong in the way a scribe might transpose a phrase or misspell a title. Wrong in the way that mattered. The version she'd been handed this morning, the clean copy prepared by the envoy's personal clerk, contained terms that did not match the original contract she had reviewed 3 days ago when the document first arrived in the herald's office. 3 days ago, the alliance granted the Marwick territories shared access to the northern trade corridor in exchange for military support along the eastern border. Standard, balanced, the kind of agreement that made both sides grumble equally, which meant it was fair. This version gave the Marwick territories exclusive rights to the corridor, exclusive access to the Draycott grain reserves during lean seasons, and a clause, buried in language so dense it would take a scholar a full afternoon to untangle, that transferred control of the northern watchtowers to Marwick Command within 5 years. Alexa had untangled it in 20 minutes. She looked at the door. Beyond it, she could hear the hum of 300 guests settling into their seats, the rustle of silk and leather and fur, the low murmur of people who had traveled for days to witness a union that would reshape the northern territories for a generation. "You look like you're about to be sick," Leda said from the corner where she was organizing the secondary documents. The court clerk pushed her spectacles up her nose and studied Alexa with the calm concern of someone who had worked beside her for 2 years. "Stage fright? You've read 100 proclamations." "Not stage fright." Alexa lifted the scroll. "Read Clause 9. Leda took it. Her eyes moved. Her face went still. "That's not what the original said." "No," Alexa agreed. "It's not." Leda set the scroll down very carefully, as if it might detonate. "You need to tell someone." "I am someone. I'm the herald. And in 50 minutes I'm supposed to read this aloud and make it law." The cathedral bells began their first sequence. 45 minutes. Alexa rolled the scroll and slid it into the leather case on her belt. She straightened her dark blue surcoat, checked that the gold herald's chain sat flat across her collarbones, and pushed open the vestry door. The cathedral swallowed her. It was enormous. Vaulted stone ceilings soared overhead, carved with wolf sigils and climbing ivy rendered in pale granite. Gold banners hung from iron brackets along both walls, catching the light from hundreds of candles arranged in iron chandeliers. The chairs were arranged in a wide crescent, 300 of them facing the raised stone platform where the bonding circle had been drawn in gold leaf on the floor. Behind the platform, a stained glass window threw colored light across the altar in reds and ambers and deep forest greens. Alexa crossed the nave toward the platform, her boots echoing on the stone. She needed to test the acoustics from the lectern. She needed to know if her voice would carry to the back row without breaking. She needed to not think about what she was going to do. She was halfway across the nave when the air changed. It started at the far end of the cathedral, near the great iron doors. A shift in the way people moved. The few early guests who had already taken their seats turned their heads in unison, and the servants adjusting flower arrangements along the aisle stopped what they were doing. One of them stepped back, pressing against the wall. Alexa turned. He walked like someone who had never once doubted that every room he entered belonged to him. Tall, broad through the shoulders, his dark blonde hair pulled half back from his face and tied with a leather cord, the rest falling just past his jaw. His dark red wool coat was buttoned to the throat, the gold wolf clasp at his collar catching candlelight with every step. The gold circlet on his head was simple, almost austere, and it suited him in a way that something ornate never could have. The Alpha King, Randolph Draycott. He was not supposed to be here yet. Protocol dictated that the king arrived last, entering from the western transept after the guests were seated and the herald had taken position. He was an hour early, and he was walking directly toward her. 20 paces. 15. His amber eyes found hers across the empty nave, and something happened in Alexa's chest that she had no name for. Not a flutter, not a skip. Something deeper, like a string she hadn't known existed, had been plucked, and the vibration traveled through her ribs and settled at the base of her throat. 10 paces. She could see the grain of the leather at his cuffs, the slight roughness along his jaw where he hadn't shaved, the faintest hint of amusement at the corner of his mouth, as though walking through his own cathedral an hour early and finding his herald standing frozen in the middle of the nave was exactly the kind of problem he preferred. 5 paces. He stopped. "You're early," he said. His voice was lower than she expected. It resonated against the stone walls, and the vibration in her chest answered it, tightening like a thread pulled taut. "So are you," she managed. "I wanted to see the room before it filled. 300 people generate a specific kind of noise. I prefer to know what silence sounds like first." He glanced at the crescent of empty chairs, then back at her. "You're the herald. Alexa Holbrook. I know who you are." He said it simply, the way someone might say the sky is blue, a fact that required no elaboration. "You read the Fenwick Trade Accord last autumn." Your voice carried to the gallery without strain. "I noticed." She had not expected the Alpha King to have noticed anything about her at all, let alone the acoustics of a routine trade reading from 8 months ago. The vibration in her chest tightened again, and she pressed her hand flat against the leather case on her belt where the fraudulent scroll sat like a coal she couldn't put down. "I need to test the room," she said. "Then test it." He stepped aside, but only slightly, not enough to create real distance. "I'll listen." She climbed the 3 steps to the platform, stood behind the lectern, and opened her mouth. What came out was not the proclamation. It was the standard opening formula, the one heralds used for acoustics checks, a string of vowels and consonants designed to test how sound traveled in a given space. Her voice filled the cathedral. It rolled along the stone, climbed the vaulted ceiling, and came back to her softened but whole. And from the floor of the nave, Randolph Draycott watched her with an expression she could not read. Not amusement, not assessment. Something closer to recognition, as though he had been waiting to hear exactly that sound in exactly this room. "It carries," he said. "It does." "You test the room before every reading?" "Always. Every space is different. The throne room swallows high notes. The council chamber sharpens them. This," she gestured at the vaulted ceiling, "is almost too generous. It wants to carry everything, even the parts you'd rather it didn't." Something moved in his expression. "Then you'll have to be careful about what you say." It was the kind of remark that could mean nothing. It was also the kind of remark that could mean everything, and the way his amber eyes held hers suggested he knew exactly which one he intended. He held her gaze for a beat longer than courtesy required. Then he turned and walked toward the western transept, his boots steady on the stone. He did not look back. Alexa exhaled and gripped the edges of the lectern until her knuckles ached. She had 40 minutes, and the wrong scroll. The rehearsal dinner had been 3 nights ago, and that was where everything began to crack. Alexa had stood at the back of the banquet hall with her hands folded behind her back and her herald's chain polished to a shine, waiting to read the formal toast. She was furniture. Heralds at banquets were always furniture, present for ceremony, invisible the rest of the time. It was a position she had learned to occupy without resentment, and occasionally it gave her a vantage point that mattered. From the back of the hall, she watched Randolph Draycott sit through Selwyn Marwick's speeches with a jaw so tight the muscle jumped even from 20 paces. She watched him exchange pleasantries with the bride's entourage with the flat, measured courtesy of a man fulfilling an obligation he found distasteful. She watched him listen to a toast about the strength of the Marwick-Draycott union and not once lift his cup. And she watched Selwyn Marwick. The treaty envoy was a compact, sharp-eyed man who wore his deep green brocade doublet like armor and his gold chain of office like a collar he enjoyed tightening on others. He smiled too often, he complimented too precisely. And twice during the dinner, Alexa caught him watching the king with an expression that was not diplomatic goodwill. It was assessment. The look of a man measuring how much weight a bridge could bear before he loaded it with everything he had. After the dinner, Alexa had gone to the herald's office to review the original contract one final time. She always reviewed the night before reading. Habit, routine, the kind of thoroughness that no one noticed and everyone benefited from. The cabinet was locked, as always. Her key turned. The drawer opened. The contract was gone. In its place was a fresh scroll, tied with the Marwick seal, written in a clerk's hand she didn't recognize. She pulled it open on her desk and read the first clause, then the second. By the fifth, her hands had gone cold. She pulled her own transcription notes from the lower drawer, the ones she always kept when reviewing alliance documents, and laid them side by side. Clause by clause, the new version had been rewritten. Not obviously. Not in ways that would catch a casual reader. The language was denser, the sentence structures more convoluted, and every major term had been tilted, quietly and precisely, in Marwick's favor. She had spent the next 2 hours untangling every alteration with Leda, who had helped her file the original 3 days earlier. "This isn't a clerical error," Leda had said, her voice pitched low even though the herald's office was empty. "This is a completely different document." "I know. What are you going to do?" That was the question, and for 2 days Alexa had carried it everywhere, the weight of it pressing against her ribs like a stone she couldn't set down. She had tried, once, to bring it to the council. She'd approached Councillor Whitley, the most senior member, during a corridor meeting the morning after the discovery. She'd said, carefully, that she had concerns about the language in the alliance document and wanted to request a formal review. Whitley had looked at her with the polite disinterest of a man who had been reviewing documents since before she was born. "The terms were negotiated by the envoy and ratified by the council," he said. "Your job is to read them, not review them." She had walked away with her jaw aching from the effort of not saying what she wanted to say. Now she stood in the vestry with 30 minutes remaining, and a choice that would reshape her life regardless of which direction she took. Read the fraudulent scroll, and the alliance would pass into law with terms that slowly strangled Draycott sovereignty. Read the real terms, the ones she had memorized from the original, and she would be accusing a foreign envoy of fraud in front of every political power in the Northern Territories. She could lose her position. She could lose her freedom. She pulled the scroll from the case and unrolled it on the table. Her eyes found Clause 9, exclusive access, grain reserves, watchtower command. "You found it," she spun. Randolph Draycott stood in the doorway of the vestry, and this time there was no amusement in his face. His amber eyes were steady, serious, and fixed on the scroll in her hands. "Found what?" she said, though the vibration in her chest was already answering. He stepped inside and closed the door. The vestry shrank. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps the room was smaller. The candlelight turned his dark red coat the color of old wine, and the gold at his collar burned. "The altered contract," he said. "I've been waiting to see if you would." She stared at him. "You knew." "I suspected. 2 weeks ago, my chancellor flagged discrepancies in the preliminary terms Marwick's envoy submitted. Minor ones. The kind that could be clerical errors. I pulled the original treaty from the Royal Archive and compared them myself." His voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely certain. Every major clause had been shifted in Marwick's favor: grain access, trade corridor exclusivity, and the watchtower provision, which is not a trade term at all. It's a military concession disguised as administrative language. Then why didn't you stop it? Because a king who rejects a marriage alliance on the morning of the ceremony creates a war. A king who presents evidence of fraud without an independent witness creates a scandal that Marwick spins as paranoia. He looked at her. But a herald who reads the real terms aloud, in front of 300 witnesses, with her voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral, that is a legal act. It enters the record. It cannot be retracted or reframed. The silence between them was heavy. Alexa's pulse hammered against the gold chain at her throat. "You positioned me," she said. "I gave you the original contract 3 days ago and waited to see what you did with it. You could have read the clean copy and never known the difference. Most heralds would have." Something shifted in his expression, and for the first time, it was not control she saw. It was warmth. "You compared them yourself. You found the fraud on your own. I didn't position you, Alexa. I trusted you." Her name in his voice did something she was not prepared for. The vibration that had lived in her chest since the nave cracked open like a fissure, and warmth flooded through her so fast her breath caught. She pressed her back against the table and gripped the edge. "I could be arrested for this. You won't be. You can't promise that. I can." He said it the way he said everything, like fact, like gravity. "I have spent 2 weeks building a case that Marwick cannot dismantle. Financial records from 3 separate provinces, testimony from his own clerk, who is currently in my chancellor's custody, composing a very detailed confession. Marwick doesn't know any of this. When you read the real terms, I will have every piece of evidence ready to present before he finishes his first objection." She stared at him. Behind the scenes. He had been working behind the scenes for 2 weeks, while she thought she was the only one who had noticed. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she whispered. "Because you deserved to make the choice yourself. Not because a king asked you to. Because you knew it was right." He paused. His jaw worked. "And because the last time I trusted someone with a political secret, they sold it to the highest bidder within a day. I needed to know you were different." "Am I?" "You're standing here with the real scroll, ready to destroy your own career to protect a kingdom that has never once thanked you for anything. Yes, you're different." She swallowed hard. The vestry felt impossibly small, the candlelight too warm, and the hum in her chest had become something she couldn't ignore. It lived there now, a constant low note that sharpened whenever he spoke and ached when he was quiet. "I've been at this post for 6 years, she said. 6 years of reading other people's words, treaties, proclamations, pardons, sentences. I've read things that changed lives, and no one ever looked at me while I did it. They looked at the scroll. They looked at the seal. I was just the voice." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very simply, "I looked at you." "I know." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "That's the problem." "Why is that a problem?" "Because in 20 minutes, I'm going to stand in front of 300 people and commit what half of them will call treason. And I need to be thinking about constitutional law, Not the fact that my chest hums every time you say my name. The corner of his mouth twitched. Your chest hums? Don't. I'm not doing anything. You're doing the thing where you're amused and trying not to show it, and it's worse than if you just laughed. He laughed. It was short, quiet, and it changed his entire face. The controlled authority cracked, and underneath it was something warm and surprised and entirely human. For a moment, he was not the Alpha King. He was just a man standing too close in a small room, laughing because a woman had told him not to. The bells rang again. 20 minutes. Alexa looked at the scroll in her hands. Then she looked at him. If I do this, she said, I'm not doing it for you. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Not yet. I know. She walked to the lectern with 15 minutes to spare and stood there while the cathedral filled. 300 guests in silks and furs and polished leather armor. The Marwick delegation on the left in their deep greens and golds. Selwyn Marwick himself in the front row with his chain of office gleaming and his smile perfectly calibrated. The Draycott council on the right, silver-haired and straight-backed. Foreign dignitaries scattered through the middle rows like colorful seeds in a gray field. The bride entered from the southern door, and she was beautiful. Young, dark-haired, draped in white silk with gold embroidery that caught the light from the stained glass window. She walked with the measured grace of someone who had been rehearsing this walk for weeks, and her expression was serene in the way that only people who have been told exactly what to feel can manage. Alexa felt a pang of something, not jealousy. Sadness, maybe. For a woman walking toward a marriage that had been built on a lie she probably didn't know about. Then Randolph entered from the western transept, and the cathedral went quiet. He walked the way he always did, steady, unhurried, commanding without performing command. The gold circlet caught the stained glass light, and for a moment, red and amber played across his face like fire. His amber eyes swept the room once, cataloging, assessing. Then they found Alexa. He held her gaze for one breath. 2. And the faintest trace of a nod moved through his jaw, so slight that no one in the first 10 rows would have caught it. She gripped the edges of the lectern. Her fingers found the wax seal on the scroll. The officiant spoke the opening benediction. The crowd bowed their heads. The bride took her position on the left side of the bonding circle. Randolph took his position on the right. The gold leaf on the floor gleamed between them. The officiant turned to Alexa and gestured. 300 faces lifted toward her. She cracked the seal. By the authority of the herald's office of the Northern Pact, she began, and her voice rolled through the cathedral exactly as she'd known it would, clear and strong and reaching every stone corner. I read into the permanent record the full and binding terms of the alliance between House Draycott and House Marwick. She paused. The cathedral was silent enough to hear candle wax dripping. She did not read from the scroll in her hands. She read from memory. Clause 1. Shared access to the Northern Trade Corridor, to be administered jointly by appointed representatives of both territories, with annual review by independent auditors. In the front row, Selwyn Marwick's smile flickered. Clause 4. Military cooperation along the eastern border, with command authority retained by the territory whose forces are deployed, and no unilateral transfer of defensive infrastructure. The smile vanished. Clause 9. Alexa's voice did not waver. Grain reserves remain under Draycott administration. Access during lean seasons is granted through formal petition, reviewed by the Draycott Council, and subject to denial without penalty. Selwyn Marwick stood up. His chair scraped against the stone floor, and the sound cut through the silence like a blade. This is not the ratified document, he said. His voice was controlled, but the tendons in his neck stood out like cords. "The Herald is reading from an unauthorized version. I demand the ceremony be halted and the official document be verified." Alexa looked at him. She had expected fury. She found something worse: calculation. He was already composing his counter-argument, already framing her as incompetent or compromised, already preparing to turn this into a question of her credibility rather than his fraud. "The version I was given this morning contains 9 material alterations from the original treaty reviewed by the Herald's office 3 days ago," she said. She kept her voice level, projecting to the back row. "Exclusive trade corridor access, replacing the shared access in the original. Unilateral grain reserve authority, replacing the petition system in the original. And a provision buried in Clause 12 that transfers command of Draycott watchtowers to Marwick administration within 5 years. She paused. She watched the information travel through the cathedral like a wave. The Draycott council members went rigid. 2 generals in the back row stood up. A woman in the foreign dignitary section pressed her hand over her mouth. "That provision," Alexa continued, "is not a trade term. It is a military concession disguised as administrative language. The original contract contained no such clause." The cathedral erupted. 300 voices at once, a roar of shock and outrage and furious whispered consultation that bounced off the stone walls and became a solid wall of sound. Selwyn Marwick's face went white, then red, and his hand moved toward his belt before he caught himself. "This is slander," he said, loud enough to cut through the noise. He stepped into the aisle, pointing at Alexa. "This woman has fabricated a conflict to sabotage an alliance negotiated in good faith for 18 months. She is a herald, not a lawyer, not a diplomat, and her authority begins and ends at reading what she is given. I demand she be removed from this platform, and the original document be produced immediately." The cathedral went half quiet, waiting. Every face turned between Alexa and Selwyn, and she felt the weight of 300 judgments pressing down on her like a physical force. "It has been." Randolph's voice was not loud. He did not shout, did not raise his chin, did not step forward with dramatic timing. He simply spoke, and the cathedral went quiet. Because when he spoke, rooms listened. He was smiling. Not broadly, not with triumph. A small, contained expression that lived mostly in his eyes, and it was aimed directly at Alexa. "My chancellor will now present financial records from 3 Marwick provinces showing fund transfers that correspond exactly to the altered clauses," he continued. "Additionally, Envoy Marwick's personal clerk has provided a signed confession detailing the process by which the original contract was replaced with the version delivered to the Herald's office this morning." From the side aisle, an older woman in a dark wool coat stepped forward carrying a leather folio. She placed it on the altar without ceremony. Selwyn Marwick looked at the folio. He looked at Randolph. He looked at Alexa. "You planned this," he said. "I prepared for it," Randolph corrected. "There's a difference. The Herald discovered the fraud independently. She chose to act independently. I simply made sure that when she did, the evidence was ready." Alexa's hands were shaking on the lectern. Not from fear. From the aftershock of adrenaline and the strange, disorienting warmth of knowing that someone had been standing behind her before she even knew she needed it. 2 guards in Draycott leather approached Selwyn Marwick from either side of the aisle. He looked at them, then at the 300 faces staring at him, and whatever he saw there took the fight out of him. His shoulders dropped. His chain of office suddenly looked very heavy. He was escorted out through the southern door without another word. The gold chain of office swung against his chest as he went, and the sound it made against the brocade was the last thing Alexa heard before the cathedral doors closed behind him. The cathedral emptied slowly, in waves of noise and motion and the kind of excited, scandalized energy that would fuel gossip in the Northern Territories for months. Delegates who had been seated on opposite sides of the crescent were now clustered together, comparing notes, confirming what they'd heard, asking each other whether the watchtower clause was really as bad as it sounded. It was worse. Alexa could have told them it was worse. The bride was taken to a private chamber by her own attendants. She had paused at the southern door and looked back at the platform where Alexa still stood. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and the young woman's expression was not fury, not betrayal, not even surprise. It was relief. The kind that comes when someone else finally says the thing you were never allowed to say yourself. Alexa stayed at the lectern until the last guest filed out. Her legs felt boneless. Her hands still trembled. The scroll she'd been given that morning lay on the lectern, untouched, its wax seal still whole. She would never read it. No one would. Then the cathedral was empty, and Randolph Draycott was standing at the base of the platform, looking up at her. "You're still shaking," he said. "I just accused a foreign envoy of treason in front of 300 people. I think shaking is reasonable. You also saved a kingdom's sovereignty. I think that earns a chair." She let out a short, disbelieving laugh. It surprised her. He climbed the 3 steps to the platform and pulled one of the officiant's chairs around to face the lectern. He set it behind her without asking whether she wanted it, and when her knees buckled, the chair was there. She sat. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his coat. The gold wolf clasp at his collar was at her eye level, and she studied it because it was easier than looking at his face. "You trusted me?" she said quietly. "Yes. You could have told me, given me the evidence. Let me read from a prepared statement. I could have." He was quiet for a moment. "But that would have made you my instrument. I didn't want an instrument. I wanted someone who looked at the truth and couldn't stay silent." A pause. "I wanted you to be exactly who you are. And if I hadn't been? If I'd read the clean copy and never noticed? Then I would have stopped the ceremony myself, and it would have started a war." He said it without drama, the way someone might describe a contingency plan for bad weather. "I had a second option. It was worse." "How much worse?" "Significantly. My version involved interrupting the officiant mid-blessing, which is technically a violation of sacred law, and then producing financial evidence in a setting where no one was prepared to evaluate it, which would have given Marwick grounds to claim duress. Your version was better. Your version was elegant," she snorted. "I don't think anyone has ever called public treason elegant. Your voice didn't shake once. Not during Clause 1, not during Clause 9, not when Marwick pointed at you and called you a liar in front of every political power in the North. I've watched seasoned diplomats buckle under less pressure than what you just handled." The vibration in her chest was not a vibration anymore. It was a hum, low and constant and warm, and it resonated every time he spoke as though his voice and her bones were tuned to the same frequency. "Why does it feel like this?" she whispered. "When you talk, when you say my name. Something in my chest, like a string being pulled." His breath caught. The first uncontrolled thing she had seen from him. His amber eyes widened slightly, and then he exhaled, slow, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. "Because that's what a bond feels like when it's been waiting." She looked up at him. He was close. Closer than protocol. Closer than sense. The candlelight from the chandeliers above turned his amber eyes to molten gold, and the warmth coming off him was not just heat from the coat. It was something else. Something that matched the hum in her chest note for note. "How long?" she asked. "Since the Fenwick reading. 8 months. You stood at a lectern half this size and read a trade accord about grain tariffs, and your voice hit a frequency that woke something in me that I didn't know was sleeping." He laughed, very quietly. "Grain tariffs, Alexa. I bonded over grain tariffs." She laughed too. It cracked through her like light through a shuttered window, and for a moment, the political wreckage and the 300 scandalized guests and the envoy being marched to a holding cell all faded to static. "You could have just invited me to dinner," she said. "Like a normal person. I'm the Alpha King. I don't get to be a normal person. You're doing a reasonable impression right now." His expression softened. Not the controlled warmth she had seen in the vestry, not the quiet intensity from the nave. Something unguarded, open in a way that the Alpha King of the Northern Territories probably never allowed himself to be. He reached down and took her hand from the edge of the lectern. His fingers were warm, calloused, careful. He held her hand the way someone holds something that matters, not tightly, but with intent. "I'm going to be very clear about something," he said, "because I've spent 8 months being unclear and it hasn't worked." He crouched so their eyes were level. "I don't want a political bride. I don't want an alliance. I want the woman who stood at my lectern and set fire to a fraudulent treaty because she couldn't live with reading a lie. I want the woman who tested the acoustics in an empty cathedral and told me the room was too generous. I want the person who noticed what every diplomat in this kingdom missed, because she takes her work seriously enough to keep her own transcription notes." Her vision blurred. She blinked hard. "That's very specific," she managed. "I'm a specific man." His thumb moved across her knuckles, slow, deliberate. "I'm also, apparently, bonded to my court herald, which is going to create some administrative complications. Significant ones. I'll manage." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles. The hum in her chest broke open into something vast and singing, and she felt it echo back from him, a resonance that filled the empty cathedral like a chord struck on an instrument the size of the room. Then he leaned forward and kissed her. It was not tentative. It was not careful. It was the kiss of a man who had waited 8 months and was finished waiting. His free hand came up to cradle the side of her face, his thumb against her jaw, and when she kissed him back, she felt the gold chain at her throat vibrate against her skin like a tuning fork. When they broke apart, she was still sitting in the officiant's chair, and he was still crouching on the platform of his own cathedral, and neither of them seemed inclined to move. "For the record," she said, "I didn't sabotage your wedding for you. I know. I did it because the contract was wrong. I know that too. But I'm not sorry about the rest of it." He smiled. The full version this time. The one she'd only seen a flash of in the nave when he'd told her he knew who she was. It transformed his face entirely, and for a moment, the Alpha King looked like nothing more than a man who had just been told the thing he wanted most was allowed. "Neither am I," he said. 2 months later, on a morning so bright the cathedral windows threw colored light halfway across the nave, Alexa stood behind the same lectern. Her dark blue surcoat had been replaced with a deep gold one, the herald's chain still at her throat, because she had refused to give up the position, and he had refused to ask her to. The scroll in her hands was new, the wax seal unbroken, and this time, every word on it was true. She had written it herself. She had reviewed it 4 times. Lita had reviewed it twice more and then cried on it, which smudged the signature line, which meant Alexa had to rewrite page 3, which meant she was now unreasonably protective of the document. Randolph stood on the platform below her, in the bonding circle, wearing the same dark red coat he'd worn the first time she'd seen him walk across this floor. The gold circlet sat on his hair, and his amber eyes were fixed on her with the kind of patient, burning focus that made her lose her place in official documents at least twice a week. 300 chairs, filled again. Different faces in some of them. The Marwick delegation was conspicuously absent. In their place sat representatives from 4 neighboring territories who had sent their congratulations with suspicious speed once word of the fraudulent treaty spread. The bride from the original ceremony had sent a gift and a letter that read, in its entirety, "Thank you. I didn't want to marry him either." Alexa had laughed for 5 minutes and then framed it. Lita sat in the 3rd row, quietly weeping into a handkerchief. She had started weeping during the processional music and showed no signs of stopping. Counselor Whitley sat 2 rows behind her, looking considerably less dismissive than he had in the corridor 8 weeks ago. He had sent Alexa a formal note of apology the day after the sabotage, worded so carefully that it had clearly been reviewed by a lawyer, and she had accepted it with the gracious professionalism of a woman who was absolutely going to hold it over him for years. Alexa cracked the seal. "By the authority of the Herald's Office of the Northern Pact," she began, and her voice filled the cathedral the way it always did, rolling along the stone and climbing the vaulted ceiling and coming back to her hole. "I read into the permanent record the full and binding terms of the bonding between Randolph Draycott, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and Alexa Holbrook, Court Herald, and, as of this morning, apparently a significant administrative complication." Laughter rippled through the cathedral. Randolph's smile reached his eyes. She read the rest of it properly, because she was a professional, and when she finished, she rolled the scroll and set it on the lectern and walked down the 3 steps to the bonding circle, where he was waiting. He took her hands. His fingers were warm. The hum between them was so constant now that she barely noticed it, the way you stop hearing a river after you've lived beside it long enough. But when he spoke, low enough that only she could hear, the frequency shifted, and the hum became a song. "For the record," he said, "I'm still bonded over grain tariffs." "For the record," she whispered back, "the room is still too generous. It carries everything." "Good," he said. "I want it to carry this." She kissed him in front of 300 guests, and this time, the cathedral did not go silent. It cheered,